Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween night in 2022 was supposed to be just another fun evening in downtown Denver. At 31, costume parties felt less exciting and more like something I had to do, but my roommate Jenna talked me into joining her and our friend Ashley for a bar crawl. We'd spent the afternoon throwing together last-minute outfits. I went as a vampire, complete with fake blood dripping from my chin. Jenna transformed into a zombie nurse, with realistic wounds painted on her arms. Ashley became a witch, spending 2 hours perfecting elaborate green face paint. We'd been close friends since college, even though we all had grown-up jobs. I was in marketing, Jenna taught elementary school, and Ashley managed a downtown boutique. We still made time for these nights out. That evening started like any other Halloween celebration: overpriced drinks, awful music, and adults stumbling around in cheap costumes. The crawl took us to 5 different bars, each one more crowded than the last. By midnight, we were exhausted and ready to head home. We'd smartly left our cars behind, planning to use a ride-share service. But when we stepped out of the last bar onto Larimer Street, the wait times for a ride were at least 45 minutes. Ashley kept refreshing her app, frustrated by the surge pricing that had tripled the normal rate, while Jenna sat on the curb, careful not to smudge her zombie makeup. That's when a guy in a firefighter costume approached us. It was one of those really realistic outfits with actual heavy gear, not a cheap party store version. He seemed friendly, pointing to a black SUV parked across the street. He explained he was a ride-share driver who'd been working all night, picking people up between parties. He claimed his app was glitching, but offered to take us for cash at the usual rate. He seemed completely legitimate. He knew the exact base fare to our neighborhood, had a pine tree air freshener hanging from his mirror, and even offered us sealed water bottles from a cooler in his back seat. What really convinced us was his professional demeanor. He checked our destination address on his phone's GPS and even confirmed our names before we'd given them. That seemed odd for a second, until Jenna laughed and said her name, and we all followed suit. He helped Ashley into the front seat. Her massive platform boots made walking tricky, while Jenna and I climbed into the back. The SUV's interior was spotless, with leather seats and phone chargers in every door pocket, just like any other ride-share I'd taken. He even had a playlist of popular music playing softly and asked if we wanted to change the station. During the ride, he chatted casually about how busy Halloween was for drivers, mentioning specific downtown street closures we'd noticed earlier and complaining about drunk passengers who'd made a mess in his car the previous weekend. The water bottles he offered were sealed and store-bought. Nothing about them seemed suspicious. I specifically remember checking, as my mom had always emphasized, stranger danger. What happened next exists only in fragments, like trying to recall a dream that keeps slipping away. I remember Ashley laughing at something on her phone, the screen's glow illuminating her green-painted face in the dark car. I remember Jenna talking about a parent at her school who complained about the Halloween decorations being too scary for kindergartners. I remember the driver adjusting his rearview mirror and asking if we needed to make any stops. Then, there's just nothing. Not darkness or sleep, but a total blank space in my memory. It's as if those hours were surgically removed from my brain. The next thing I knew, I was waking up fully clothed on my couch at 4 p.m. on Sunday. I was still in my vampire costume, the fake blood now crusty and flaking onto the cushions. My phone was dead on the coffee table. My keys were somehow in the kitchen sink, and my shoes were neatly placed by the front door, even though I never put them there. My first impulse was to charge my phone, desperate to piece together what had happened through texts or photos. But there was nothing after midnight. Just 13 missed calls from Ashley's boyfriend, Connor. My call log showed I'd supposedly called Jenna at 3:47 a.m., but I had absolutely no memory of it. When I tried calling her back, it went straight to voicemail. The real panic began when Connor answered on the first ring, his voice frantic, asking if Ashley was with me. She hadn't come home, he said. She hadn't answered any of his calls or texts, and her phone was going straight to voicemail, just like Jenna's. He'd already called the hospitals and even driven to her parents' house in Aurora, thinking she might have gone there. But no one had seen her since she left for the bar crawl with us. My head was throbbing, not a normal hangover, but a deep, disorienting fog that made thinking feel like wading through syrup. I told Connor I'd just woken up and couldn't remember anything after getting into that car. The silence on his end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Jenna showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later, still in her zombie nurse costume, mascara streaking down her face like black rivers. She had the exact same story, waking up in her own bed with no memory of how she got there. Her apartment door was unlocked, even though she was meticulous about security. Her purse contents were spread across her kitchen counter in a way she'd never leave them. Neither of us could recall anything after those first few minutes in the SUV, but both of us had woken up safely in our homes while Ashley was simply gone. We spent the next 3 hours retracing our steps, calling every bar we'd visited, even walking down Larimer Street, looking for that black SUV or anyone dressed as a firefighter who might have been driving for ride shares. The bars all remembered us. It was hard to forget 3 women in elaborate costumes, but nobody had security footage of the street where we'd been picked up. One bouncer at the 3rd bar mentioned he'd seen us talking to someone in firefighter gear, saying the guy had been hanging around all night, but wasn't actually going into any bars, just lingering on the sidewalks where people were looking for rides. Connor had already filed a missing person report by Sunday evening. 2 detectives came to my apartment Monday morning to take our statements. Detective Garrison, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair, kept asking about the water bottles. Did we drink them? Did we see him drink one? Did we keep any of them? Of course, we hadn't kept them, and neither Jenna nor I could even remember if we'd actually drunk the water or just held the bottles. The younger Detective Reeves was more interested in the driver himself, pulling up photos on his tablet of registered ride-share drivers to see if we recognized anyone. None of them looked familiar, but then again, between the darkness and our intoxicated state, I could barely picture his face beyond a vague impression of stubble and what might have been brown eyes. They asked about the make and model of the SUV, but all I could tell them was that it was black, maybe a Chevy or GMC. Definitely newer, because it had that backup camera screen in the dashboard. Jenna remembered even less, just that the seats were tan or beige leather, and that there had been an energy drink can in one of the cup holders. The breakthrough came Wednesday afternoon when Detective Garrison called to say they'd found security footage from an ATM camera 2 blocks from where we'd been picked up. The timestamp showed 12:23 a.m. Our car was pulling away from the curb, with all 3 of us visible through the windows. The license plate was partially obscured by mud or something deliberately smeared on it, but they could make out that it was a Colorado plate, starting with F. More importantly, they tracked the vehicle through various traffic cameras heading east through downtown, but then it simply vanished after turning to an industrial area near the railroad tracks. No cameras covered that specific zone, and the SUV never emerged onto any of the main roads that had surveillance. They dispatched units to search the area, checking abandoned warehouses and empty lots, but it was like the vehicle had simply evaporated. Garrison mentioned something that made my chest tighten. The ATM footage showed the driver briefly getting out to help Ashley into the front seat, and he was wearing thick work gloves despite it being a warm October night. Friday morning changed everything in the worst possible way. A jogger found Ashley's phone in a drainage ditch about 8 miles outside the city limits, near an old access road that no one used anymore except for illegal dumping. The phone was still recording. It had been recording audio since 12:31 a.m. Sunday morning, roughly 8 minutes after we'd gotten into that SUV. 67 hours of continuous audio until the battery finally died. The police wouldn't tell us everything on the recording, but Detective Garrison's face when she mentioned it spoke volumes. She went pale, explaining that the first hour contained mostly muffled voices and car sounds, then long periods of silence broken by occasional noises they were still analyzing. What they did share was that around the 40-minute mark, you could clearly hear Ashley's voice saying she felt sick, then asking why we weren't responding to her. After that, her voice didn't appear on the recording again, just ambient sound and what might have been footsteps on gravel much later. The audio revealed something else that made everything infinitely worse. At 1:15 a.m., you could clearly hear a garage door opening and closing. Then there were distinct sounds of movement, like furniture being shifted or heavy objects being dragged across concrete. At 20:47 a.m., there was the sound of a different vehicle starting, probably a truck based on the engine noise. The recording captured this second vehicle driving for approximately 22 minutes before stopping. Then came the worst part, the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, rhythmic and methodical for nearly an hour. The police had tech specialists enhancing the audio, trying to pick up any identifying sounds or voices during those crucial hours. They also used the phone's GPS data to track its movement, but whoever had it had disabled location services after the first hour, and the phone had stayed in that ditch from approximately 4:00 a.m. Sunday until it was found Friday. Garrison asked if we remembered anyone mentioning construction sites or property outside the city, but our minds were just blank walls where those hours should have been. Saturday brought the most terrifying revelation yet when the tech team managed to enhance a portion of the audio from around 3:30 a.m. They isolated what sounded like a muffled conversation between two men, our firefighter and someone else. The second voice was asking about the other two and whether they'd remember anything. The response was too garbled to make out completely, but the specialists detected the word "dosy" and something that sounded like their apartments. That's when I realized with absolute clarity that this man had been in my home, had physically carried me inside, arranged my belongings, and left me on my couch like some kind of twisted dollhouse figure. Jenna broke down completely when we heard this, realizing he'd done the same to her, had probably stood in our bedrooms, watching us unconscious, deciding what to do with us. The police immediately processed our apartments for DNA and fingerprints, but whoever this was had been meticulous. Not a single print besides ours. No DNA evidence, no fibers or hair that didn't belong to us or our regular visitors. Even the water bottles from the car were gone, likely disposed of along with any other evidence from the vehicle. The investigation intensified, with the FBI getting involved due to the suspected kidnapping potentially crossing state lines, based on some background noise in the audio that suggested movement into Wyoming or Nebraska. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the industrial area where the SUV had vanished. While the dogs alerted to several spots, no body was found yet. Meanwhile, Connor was barely functioning, staying at his parents' house because he couldn't bear to be in the apartment he'd shared with Ashley. The worst part was how calculated everything had been. This person had studied ride-share apps, knew exactly what price to quote, understood which areas had surveillance gaps, and had somehow managed to drug 3 people so precisely that 2 of us survived while 1 disappeared. He'd even known our names before we gave them, which meant he'd been watching us throughout the night, possibly heard us introduce ourselves at one of the bars or seen our IDs when they were checked. The firefighter costume wasn't random either. People inherently trust first responders, letting their guard down around someone who seems like a hero. Every single detail had been orchestrated, from the legitimate-looking car setup to knowing exactly how to make Jenna and me appear like we'd just had too much to drink, ensuring no one would immediately suspect foul play when we couldn't remember our night. The break in the case came 2 weeks later through pure luck. A construction worker renovating an old fire station 40 miles away found a firefighter costume stuffed behind a loose wall panel, along with a set of car keys and a roll of cash. The keys belonged to a black Suburban registered to a man named Gregory Hoffman, who'd been reported missing by his family 3 days before Halloween. His SUV was found a week after that, completely stripped and burned in a field near the Kansas border. But forensics still managed to pull DNA from blood traces in the trunk that matched Ashley. Gregory Hoffman's body turned up in his own basement. He'd been dead since October 28th, killed in his own home while his family thought he was away on a hunting trip. The real killer had taken his vehicle, his identity, and used both to hunt on Halloween night. Security footage from a gas station near Gregory's house showed a man filling up the Suburban on October 30th, wearing a baseball cap and keeping his face turned away from cameras. But his build matched what little we could remember. The same man appeared on traffic cameras driving toward downtown Denver on Halloween night, already wearing the firefighter costume. They never found Ashley's body, though they searched for months using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams. They never caught the man who took her either. The DNA found at Gregory's house didn't match anyone in the system, and the fingerprints they lifted from Gregory's basement door were from someone who'd never been arrested or worked in any job requiring prints. Jenna moved back to Ohio to live with her family, unable to handle staying in Denver. Connor left the state entirely. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Florida trying to start over. As for me, I still live in the same apartment, though I installed 3 deadbolts and a security system that would rival a bank's. I still can't remember those missing hours, even after trying hypnotherapy and various other treatments to recover the memories. Sometimes I wonder if not remembering is actually a mercy, if my brain is protecting me from something too horrible to process. The police keep the case open, calling occasionally when they have a lead that never pans out. They did tell me one last detail from the audio. In the final hours of recording, just before the phone died, you could hear a distant train horn and what sounded like someone whistling a children's song, though they could never identify which one. Ashley's parents still call me sometimes, not blaming me, but desperately hoping I'll remember something, anything that might help them find their daughter. All I can tell them is what I know, that she got in that car with us. And then she was gone, and 2 of us were lucky enough to wake up. Halloween night in 2018. At 16, I was completely preoccupied with whether Brad from chemistry had noticed my new haircut. My parents owned a little bookstore downtown, and we lived on the edge of Riverside, California, in an old Victorian house that bordered the woods. My younger brother, Nathan, was at a sleepover that night, and my parents had gone to bed around 11:00 p.m. after giving out candy to the last trick, or treaters. I stayed up in my room, scrolling through Instagram and texting my best friend Kayla about the party we had missed because my dad thought it would run too late. The house was finally quiet, broken only by the creak of old wood settling and the wind rustling the leaves of the massive oak tree outside my window. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard a soft, rhythmic knocking coming from downstairs. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just persistent. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 knocks, a pause. I first assumed some drunk teenagers were playing a prank, trying for one last Halloween scare. We'd had issues before with kids from the high school egging houses or leaving unsettling dolls on porches. I crept out of my room, avoiding the loose floorboard by my door, and made my way into the hallway. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as if the person outside had all the time in the world. From the landing, I could see our front door through the stair railings. The porch light was on, casting long, distorted shadows through the frosted glass panels. I tiptoed down to the living room and moved toward the window next to the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The blinds were closed, but I was able to angle them slightly to peek outside without being seen. What I saw made my breath catch. There was a woman sitting on our porch steps, facing away from the door. She was barefoot, which seemed odd for late October, and her shoulders were shaking, either from crying or the cold. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging down her back in dark, matted strands. She wore what looked like a light blue dress or nightgown, but even from behind, I could see dark stains spreading across the fabric. The way she sat, hunched over and rocking slightly, made her look utterly broken. She had stopped knocking and was just trembling in the yellow porch light. I must have made a slight sound, because she began to turn her head, and I instantly stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the pulse in my ears. Part of me wanted to wake my parents, but another part kept thinking maybe she was hurt and needed help. I peered through the blinds again, catching a partial view of her profile. Her face was pale, almost gray under the light, and there were dark streaks running down her cheeks. I couldn't tell if it was makeup, dirt, or something else. She kept glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the street, as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. Then, she started knocking again, harder this time. I heard her voice, hoarse and desperate, calling out something I couldn't quite make out through the door. The knocking became loud enough that I heard my parents' bedroom door open upstairs. My dad came down in his pajamas and bathrobe, squinting in the hallway light. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing me plastered against the wall by the window. I whispered about the woman outside. He frowned and moved to look through the peephole. I watched his expression shift from annoyed to deeply concerned in seconds. He turned to me and said quietly, "Go get your mother. Tell her to bring her phone." While I ran upstairs, I heard him unlocking the deadbolt. My mom was already awake, sitting up in bed, and when I told her about the woman, she grabbed her phone and followed me back down. We found my dad standing in the doorway, the the security chain still latched, talking to someone outside. Through the small gap in the door, I could hear the woman's voice clearly now, raw and frantic. Please, please, you have to help me. He's coming for me. I got away, but he's coming. Please let me in, please. Her words spilled out in a rush, some slurred as if she were drunk or in shock. My dad tried to calm her, asking what happened, who was after her, if she needed an ambulance. But she kept repeating the same desperate pleas. Someone was coming, she'd barely escaped, and we needed to call the police right now. My mom was already dialing 911, giving our address in the calm, controlled voice she used during emergencies. The woman outside started crying harder, making these horrible, choking sobs that made my chest tighten. Then, suddenly she went quiet and whispered, "Oh God, I hear his car. He found me. He found me again." My dad immediately slammed the door shut and locked it, telling us to get away from the windows. The woman outside started pounding on the door, screaming now, begging us not to leave her out there. It was awful, the sound of pure terror in her voice. My mom was still on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining the situation and stressing that we needed officers immediately. Through all the chaos, I didn't hear any car engine. I didn't see any headlights through the curtains. But the woman was hysterical, scrambling around our porch, her bare feet slapping against the wooden boards. We could hear her trying our windows, pulling at them desperately. My dad grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and positioned himself between us and the front door. For perhaps 30 seconds, everything went silent except for my mom's voice giving details to the police. Then we heard the woman shriek. It wasn't a scream of fear, but something primal and furious, followed by the sound of her running, those bare feet slapping down our porch steps and onto the gravel driveway. I rushed to the side window, despite my dad yelling at me to stay back. In the moonlight, I saw her running toward the tree line behind our house, her pale dress or nightgown flowing behind her like a ghost. She moved fast for someone who had seemed so injured and desperate, disappearing into the woods within seconds. The police arrived about 8 minutes later, 2 patrol cars with flashing lights. Officers with flashlights checked our porch and yard. They found drops and smears of blood on our steps and bare footprints in the dirt leading toward the woods. My parents explained everything while I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to process what had just happened. The officers took our statements, and 2 of them went into the woods with their flashlights, while the others stayed to search the area around our house. We waited in the living room for what felt like forever, drinking the coffee my mom had made to keep us alert. The officers who had entered the woods came back after about 40 minutes, shaking their heads. They had followed the footprints for perhaps a quarter mile before losing them near the creek that runs through the forest. No sign of the woman anywhere. They called for backup in a K-9 unit, expanding the search area. One officer stayed at our house in case she came back, while the others coordinated the search. My dad kept pacing, double-checking the locks on all the doors and windows. None of us could understand why someone so desperate for help would suddenly flee like that, especially barefoot into the woods at night. The officer suggested that sometimes domestic violence victims act erratically, torn between seeking help and protecting their abusers. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to me. The way she'd said someone was coming when there was no car, the way she had switched from terrified to furious in an instant. Around 4:00 a.m., we got the news. A detective came to our door, his face serious and tired. They had found a silver sedan crashed into a ravine about 3 miles from our house on the old service road that runs parallel to the woods. It was completely smashed up like it had sped off the road. Inside were 2 bodies, a man in his 30s in the driver's seat and a woman in the passenger seat. Both had been dead for hours, the detective said, probably since before midnight. The woman matched the general description of who we'd seen: similar hair color, similar age. But here is the detail that made everyone go silent: both bodies were still wearing their seat belts, and there was no evidence anyone else had been in the car. The blood pattern showed they had both died on impact. There was no way either of them could have walked away from that crash, much less run to our house and pound on our door. The detective asked us more questions, having us describe every detail of the woman we'd seen. They brought a forensic team to collect the blood samples from our porch and photograph the footprints. My mom showed them the recording from our doorbell camera. We'd forgotten about it in all the chaos. The footage was grainy, but you could see her clearly enough, a woman in a pale blue dress sitting on our steps, then standing and pounding on the door, then running toward the woods. The timestamp showed 12:47 a.m., but according to the coroner's initial assessment, the accident had happened around 1100 p.m., maybe earlier. The detective kept asking if we were sure we had only seen one woman, if maybe someone else had been hiding nearby. But we all saw the same person, heard the same voice. They continued searching for days, even bringing in dogs specially trained to track injured people. Nothing. No other footprints, no torn fabric on branches, no blood trail in the woods beyond our property. The official investigation went on for weeks. They identified the victims, a couple from 2 towns over driving back from a Halloween party. The man had been drinking and had taken the back road to avoid the main highway, losing control on a curve, but they never found any logical explanation for what we experienced that night. No escaped mental patient, no missing person who matched the woman we'd seen, no identical twin sister. The blood on our porch matched the female victim from the crash, but the forensics team couldn't explain how it got there. Eventually, the case was closed as an accident with unexplained circumstances. We moved out 6 months later, not exactly because we were scared, but because none of us could walk past those porch steps without remembering her desperate voice, her frantic knocking, the way she had run into the darkness. I still dream about it sometimes. I wake up thinking I hear someone at the door begging to be let in. The thing about college parties is that, eventually, they all blur into one messy memory. But that October night at the house on Birch Avenue is seared into my brain like a permanent, ugly mark. I was midway through my junior year at State University, juggling brutal economics courses and subsisting on ramen and energy drinks, just like every other broke student. My roommate, Jake Sullivan, and I had been inseparable since freshman orientation, one of those friendships that locks into place immediately. Jake had an almost uncanny ability to connect with anyone. He could walk into a room of strangers and leave with 5 new contacts and a weekend schedule planned. He was the guy who would lend you his last $20, drive miles at 300 a.m. to rescue you when your ride canceled, and knew exactly when to crack a terrible joke to relieve the tension of finals week. That particular Saturday night, we were headed to what everyone was calling the party of the semester, hosted by a group of seniors renting this massive, ancient house that looked like it hadn't seen a repair since the 1970s. Jake and I showed up around 10 o'clock in matching zombie costumes, thrift store clothes we'd shredded with scissors and doused in fake blood that seemed to stain everything we touched. The house was absolutely packed when we walked in, easily 200 people crushed wall to wall. The air was so thick with artificial fog and body heat that taking a breath felt like a workout. The hosts had gone all out, transforming the place with seizure-inducing strobe lights in the living room and a chaotic makeshift bar in the kitchen. But the basement was the main draw. They'd converted it into an underground club with ultraviolet lights everywhere, the concrete walls covered in neon paint that glowed like toxic waste in the darkness. Getting down there meant fighting through a mass of sweaty bodies on stairs so narrow you had to turn sideways, everyone holding their drinks overhead to avoid a spill. Once you hit the bottom, the heat was overwhelming, and the bass from the speaker system was so intense it felt like your bones were vibrating. The crowd was so dense, we moved as one giant organism in the darkness. Around midnight, Jake and I were pressed against the back wall, trying to catch our breath between songs. The careful face paint we'd applied earlier was now streaming down our faces in gray streaks, making us look more like melting wax figures. Jake had been dancing with a girl dressed as a vampire, but she'd gone upstairs with her friends, leaving him doing these exaggerated dance moves to make me laugh. The crowd around us was getting wilder. People were climbing on shoulders, and drinks were flying. Jake leaned over and shouted in my ear that he needed air, that the heat was making him dizzy, and he started pushing his way toward what he thought was an exit door in the corner. I nodded and turned back to the crowd, assuming he'd be back in 5 minutes, like always. There were so many people crushed together that when someone pushed from behind, we all surged forward like dominoes. By the time I looked back to where Jake had been heading, he had already vanished into the mass of bodies. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Jake still hadn't returned. At first, I wasn't worried. I figured he'd run into someone upstairs, Maybe got stuck in a conversation or was waiting in the perpetually long bathroom line. I pushed my way up the basement stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, my sweat-soaked shirt going cold against my skin. The main floor was equally packed but definitely cooler. I checked the kitchen, the back porch where smokers gathered, and even waited outside the bathroom. I asked a few people if they'd seen a tall guy in a zombie costume, but that description fit half the party guests. The really odd thing was that Jake's phone kept going straight to voicemail, not ringing, just immediate silence, as if it were turned off or dead. That was completely out of character for him. Jake answered texts mid-shower and carried a portable charger because he never let his phone die. By 1:00 a.m. I was starting to panic. I'd searched every room in the house twice, even fought my way back down to the basement, thinking I might have missed him in the crowd. I found a guy named Steve, who lived down the hall from us in the dorms, and explained that my roommate was missing. He helped me search again. We checked every closet, every dark corner, and even the backyard where people had built a bonfire in a metal trash can. Steve suggested Jake might have left with someone, but that didn't track. Jake would have texted me, sent one of his stupid, specific emoji combinations. He would have let me know he was going. Plus, his car was still parked exactly where we'd left it 3 blocks away. I ran out to check it, hoping he'd felt sick and gone to sleep it off. The windows were fogged up from the cold, but I could see well enough to confirm he wasn't inside, and his spare key was still hidden in the magnetic box under the wheel well, where he always kept it. I finally found the host, a senior named Kevin Brennan, and asked him if there were any other exits from the basement, or anywhere Jake could have gone for air. Kevin looked at me like I was insane. His pupils dilated and clearly several drinks deep into the night. He insisted the basement only had one entrance, those narrow stairs, and that the door in the corner had been locked and blocked off for months. When I insisted Jake had headed toward that corner door, Kevin grew defensive. He said that area was off limits, that they had specifically piled boxes and old furniture in front of it to keep people from messing around back there. But Jake had definitely walked in that direction. I could picture it clearly, him weaving through the crowd, his hand raised in that half-wave he always did, moving straight for that corner. Kevin started getting aggressive, asking why I was trying to cause problems, saying my friend probably just left without telling me and that I needed to chill out and stop making accusations. The music was still pounding from the basement, but suddenly it felt menacing instead of fun, like the rhythm of something terrible happening just out of sight. Steve and I went back down to the basement one last time, using our phone flashlights to cut through the UV lighting and actually see that corner clearly. The crowd had thinned just enough that we could push through to the back wall. There were certainly boxes stacked up, old, water-damaged cardboard, and what looked like a broken couch standing on its end. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. The dust patterns didn't match either. You could see clean, rectangular shapes where boxes had been sitting for a long time, but they weren't lined up with where the boxes were now. Someone had moved all this stuff recently, perhaps even tonight. Steve saw it too, and started pulling at one of the boxes to see what was behind them. But then Kevin appeared with 2 other guys, all of them larger than us, telling us we needed to leave immediately. They weren't asking. They physically grabbed our arms and started marching us toward the stairs, Kevin saying he'd call the police if we didn't get out of his house right now, that we were disrupting the party and frightening people. They literally threw us out the front door, Steve stumbling and nearly falling down the porch steps. I tried to explain one more time that my best friend was missing, that something was seriously wrong. But Kevin just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his face shifting from friendly host to something cold and dangerous. He said Jake had probably just found a girl and bailed, that it happened all the time, and if I came back or caused more trouble, he'd ensure campus security heard about it. The door slammed in our faces, the deadbolt clicking into place, and suddenly we were standing on the sidewalk in the cold October air while the party continued inside without us. Steve wanted to leave. He kept saying we should just wait until tomorrow when everyone sobered up, but I couldn't shake the image of those scrape marks on the floor. I called Jake's phone 50 times, sent text after text, and even considered calling his mom, but hung up before it connected, realizing I had no cohesive story. The police would laugh at me, probably assume he was just drunk somewhere or had hooked up, as everyone kept suggesting. I stayed outside that house until 4:00 a.m., sitting in my car parked across the street, watching people slowly trickle out as the party died down. Around 30:30, I saw Kevin and his roommates carrying garbage bags out to the curb, moving quickly and quietly, like they didn't want to draw attention. One of the bags tore open when they tossed it, and I could see what looked like discarded clothing spilling out, but they quickly gathered everything up and stuffed it into another bag before I could get a better look. My phone battery finally died around dawn, and I drove back to campus, my mind racing through every possible, impossible explanation. Sunday morning, I filed a missing person report with campus police, even though they clearly didn't take it seriously at first. The officer kept asking if Jake had been drinking, if we'd argued, if he had a history of running off without notice. I gave them Kevin's name and address, explaining everything about the basement, the blocked door, and the suspicious behavior, pointing out that Jake's car was still there. It wasn't until I mentioned that Jake was scheduled to take a midterm exam on Monday, that he had perfect attendance and would never miss an exam, that they finally agreed to do a welfare check at the house. I went with them, sitting in the back of the patrol car as we drove to Birch Avenue, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. The house looked different in the daylight, shabbier, smaller, with limp and sad Halloween decorations hanging from the porch railings. Kevin answered the door, looking haggard and annoyed, but his expression changed quickly when he saw the uniforms. He suddenly became cooperative, even concerned, saying he'd help however he could, that he hoped Jake was okay, that these parties sometimes got out of hand and people wandered off. The police searched the main floors first while Kevin followed them around, insisting that hundreds of people had been through the house, and it would be impossible to know where everyone went. When they got to the basement, I watched Kevin's jaw tighten as they approached that corner with the stacked boxes. He quickly insisted that area was just storage, that it had been blocked off for months because of water damage, and that no one could have gone back there during the party. But one of the officers, an older woman with sharp eyes, noticed the same scrape marks I'd seen and asked Kevin to move the boxes. He protested at first, citing danger and the landlord's rules, but the officers insisted. It took them about 10 minutes to clear everything away, Kevin growing more agitated with each box they moved. Behind all that junk was a door, just like I'd suspected, but it was heavy wood reinforced with metal brackets and secured with a brand new padlock. Kevin immediately claimed he didn't have the key, that the landlord must have locked it, that it probably just led to old heating equipment. The officers made him call the landlord right there. The landlord, a nervous older man named George Hoffman, arrived within 20 minutes. He fumbled with a ring of keys before finding the right one, his hands trembling as he worked the padlock. The door opened to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness, much deeper than the basement level, with a smell coming up that made everyone step back, musty, metallic, and wrong. The police went down first with flashlights while we waited above. Kevin was now completely silent, his face gray. I could hear them moving around, their voices echoing strangely, and then one of them shouted for everyone to get back, to not come any closer. The older officer came up the stairs fast, already on her radio, calling for backup and crime scene technicians, her face pale. She wouldn't tell me what they'd found, just kept saying to wait outside, that this was now an active investigation. But I heard her tell the dispatcher they had discovered what appeared to be an old storm shelter that had been recently accessed, with evidence of blood and a single brown leather sneaker that matched the description of what Jake had been wearing. Within an hour, the entire street was blocked off with police tape. Detectives and a forensic team swarmed the house. They arrested Kevin and his 3 roommates on the spot, putting them in separate patrol cars while they processed the scene. I sat on the curb across the street for hours, watching them carry evidence bags out of that house, each one draining a little more of my hope. Finally, a detective named Melissa Chen came over and sat beside me, her voice gentle as she explained what they'd pieced together so far. The storm shelter had been built in the 1950s during the Cold War, a concrete bunker that previous tenants had used for storage until it was supposedly sealed off 5 years ago. But Kevin and his roommates had discovered it when they moved in, and had been using it to run some kind of underground fighting ring, bringing drunk college kids down there to fight for money, while others bet on the outcomes. Jake had apparently stumbled onto their operation when he went looking for that exit door, seeing something he shouldn't have through a gap in the boxes. They panicked and grabbed him, dragging him down to the shelter to figure out what to do. But Jake had fought back harder than they expected. During the struggle, he'd managed to break free and run deeper into the tunnels, passages connected to the city's old maintenance system. And they'd lost him in the maze. Search teams spent 2 weeks combing through those tunnels with dogs and thermal cameras, and finally found Jake about a mile from the house alive, but barely. He had been wandering in complete darkness for 3 days, had fallen down a maintenance shaft and broken his leg, and survived by drinking condensation off the pipes. He lost a frightening amount of weight and couldn't stop shaking for weeks afterward. But he was alive, and that's all that mattered to me. Kevin was sentenced to 15 years for kidnapping and running an illegal gambling operation. His roommates received lesser sentences for their cooperation. The university shut down all parties at off-campus houses for the rest of the year, and that old house on Birch Avenue was condemned and demolished by spring. Jake spent a month in physical therapy, learning to walk properly again, and another 3 months in counseling, dealing with the trauma of being trapped underground in complete darkness. He never talks about what he saw in that shelter before he ran. He just gets a distant look and changes the subject. We're still roommates, still best friends, but something shifted that night. We both learned how quickly a normal college party could turn into a nightmare, how the people serving you drinks might be hiding something monstrous right beneath your feet. Jake graduated last May and got a job at an accounting firm downtown. I'm finishing up my senior year now, but neither of us goes to house parties anymore. Jake still sleeps with a nightlight on. He still checks every door in a room to make sure he knows where the exits are. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, rubbing the scar on his leg from where the bone broke through, and I know he's back in those tunnels, running through the darkness, trying to find his way out. Frank Dawson's Halloween displays were legendary on Cedar Ridge Drive, the kind of spectacle real estate agents actually used to sell houses in the area. Every October, he transformed his front yard in Portland into something straight off a horror movie studio lot. He had mannequins so lifelike that delivery drivers often refused to walk past them after dark, opting to leave packages at the edge of his property. His signature fake blood was glossy and thick, splattered across his driveway in patterns, suggesting a body had been dragged toward his garage. The scene was completed with motion, activated screams, strobe lights hidden in the bushes, and a fog machine that billowed out thick clouds, turning the entire lawn into a crime photographer's nightmare. The neighborhood had long accepted Frank's obsession as a quirky local tradition. Parents would walk their children by during the day for a harmless fright. Teenagers dared each other to touch the corpse dummy that always seemed to be reaching out from under his porch. Even the police had stopped responding to concerned calls from people unfamiliar with Frank's hobby. He worked construction during the day, but spent every free moment in October perfecting his setup, adding new pieces he'd been crafting in his garage since January. Last year, he'd introduced an unsettling piece, a mannequin of a jogger sprawled across his lawn, with running shoes still on and earbuds trailing from its ears, positioned as if attacked mid-run. The attention to detail, sweat stains on the shirt, grass stains on the knees, was genuinely unnerving. This year, Frank started earlier than usual, dragging materials out on October 1st. I watched from my living room window as he arranged what looked like an entire crime scene: yellow tape, evidence markers next to pools of his fake blood, and bodies placed at strange angles across the grass. But his main centerpiece this year made me pause mid-sip of my coffee. Right in the middle of his lawn, illuminated by a spotlight, was a man in a business suit, face down with one arm stretched toward the sidewalk as if he'd been trying to crawl away. The suit was navy blue with subtle pinstripes, the kind you'd see in any downtown office, and a briefcase was spilled open nearby, papers scattered and stained brown by an overturned coffee cup. What struck me was how fresh everything looked. Usually, Frank's props have obviously fake quality, even when well made. But this businessman dummy looked different. The suit fabric had natural wrinkles where the body was positioned. The leather shoes had scuff marks, and when the wind picked up, I swore the jacket fluttered too naturally for a stuffed mannequin. Frank spent hours adjusting the scene, moving the briefcase a few inches, repositioning papers, stepping back to admire his work like an artist. When he finally went inside that evening, I found myself staring at that suited figure, trying to pinpoint exactly why it felt so much more convincing than his previous displays. By day 3, the smell started. At first, I thought Frank had gone overboard with some artificial rotting effect to add a sensory element. The October heat wave, with temperatures hitting the mid-70s, wasn't helping. That sweet, heavy odor would drift across my yard when the wind shifted, forcing me to close my windows despite the warmth. Other neighbors did the same. Mrs. Golinsky from 2 houses down came over to ask if I knew what Frank was using. She said the smell was so bad her beagle wouldn't even walk past his house anymore. The mailman started leaving Frank's mail at the edge of the driveway. Frank, however, seemed oblivious. Every evening he'd come out with a beer, sit on his porch steps, and admire his handiwork, completely unaware that people were speed walking past his property with shirts pulled up over their noses. On October 4th, I finally went over to talk to him, catching him as he was adjusting some of the papers around the dummy. The smell hit me like a physical wall 10 feet from the display. That thick, cloying stench that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. It was nothing like artificial Halloween scents. Frank just laughed when I mentioned it, claiming he'd found a new decomposition spray, online, super realistic military-grade stuff. Standing that close, I noticed more details that made my skin prickle. There was a wedding ring on the left hand, a tungsten band that used to be popular, and a watch that was still ticking. I could see the second hand moving. The hair also looked real, not synthetic, but actual human hair with gray streaks at the temples, individual strands moving in the breeze. When I commented on how incredibly realistic it looked, Frank got a weird, confused expression. He said he hadn't added any new props this year, just rearranged his old ones better. That didn't make sense. I'd never seen this particular dummy before, and I'd watched him set up for 5 years straight. He brushed off my questions, but as he went back to his work, I noticed he kept glancing at the businessman prop with a puzzled look, like he was trying to remember where it came from. That night, I couldn't sleep. The smell was getting stronger, and I had a heavy feeling in my gut. Around 2:00 a.m., I got up and looked out my window. Maybe it was my tired eyes, but the position looked different. The outstretched arm seemed to have moved a few inches closer to the sidewalk. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, telling myself I was being paranoid but wanting proof. The next morning, I compared the photo to the real thing. The arm had definitely shifted. When I saw Frank later, he insisted he hadn't touched anything since yesterday evening. Why would I be messing with it at 2 in the morning? On October 5th was when things truly went sideways. I was grading papers when I heard a commotion outside, dogs barking wildly, car doors slamming, voices shouting. Through the window, I saw Mrs. Kolinsky's beagle had gotten loose and run straight into Frank's yard, going right for the businessman display. The dog was pawing at the figure, whimpering and trying to grab something with its teeth. Mrs. Kolinsky was screaming for her dog, but wouldn't step on Frank's property. Frank ran out, yelling at the dog, but when he got close enough to grab the collar, he suddenly froze. The color drained from his face as he stared down at what the dog had dislodged, a wallet that had fallen out of the man's pocket. Frank picked it up with trembling fingers, opened it, and I could see him mouth the words, "Oh God," over and over as he looked at the ID inside. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Frank's call, 3 patrol cars, a van, and plainclothes officers who immediately began putting up real crime scene tape that looked exactly like Frank's fake ones. They cleared everyone back, but from my porch I could hear fragments of their radio chatter. Missing person. Robert Henley, local insurance adjuster, hadn't come home from work 6 days ago. His wife had reported him missing on October 2nd. The way the police were looking at Frank, meticulously photographing his entire display, it was clear they suspected him. Frank kept shaking his head, explaining over and over that he'd found the businessman already positioned when he started setting up on October 1st. He swore he thought someone had played an early prank by adding an extra prop to his collection, assuming it was just a particularly realistic dummy. The coroner confirmed what the smell had been telling us all along. Robert Henley had been dead for approximately 6 days, likely killed elsewhere and deliberately placed in Frank's yard sometime during the night of September 30th. The real kicker came when detectives found security footage from the house 3 doors down that had a partial view of Frank's yard. The grainy video showed a van pulling up around 3:00 a.m. on October 1st. Someone in dark clothes was seen dragging something heavy across Frank's lawn, spending about 15 minutes carefully arranging it among the existing Halloween decorations. The person knew exactly what they were doing, positioning the body to blend in perfectly with Frank's signature style. They'd even scattered fake evidence markers around. The detective told me later that whoever did it had probably been watching Frank's displays for years, knew his patterns, knew he'd start setting up on October 1st, and wouldn't look too closely at what was already there. They never did catch who did it. The van was stolen and found burned out 2 counties over a week later. Robert Henley's murder went cold after all the leads dried up. He was just a regular guy who sold insurance and coached Little League, whose body ended up as part of a Halloween display for 5 days before anyone realized. Frank took down all his decorations the day after the police finished processing his yard. Not just for that year, but permanently. I helped him haul boxes to the dump. He couldn't stand to look at any of it anymore, he said, and moved away 3 months later. The new family that bought his house has no idea why no one on our street really decorates for Halloween anymore. Why we all just leave our porch lights off and pretend we're not home when October 31st rolls around. Some things just kill the spirit of a holiday, you know. And every time I smell that particular sick, sweet odor, whether it's roadkill or spoiled meat, I'm instantly transported back there, watching Frank realize he'd been tending to a corpse for 5 days, adjusting its position, proud of how realistic his display had been this year. Every house on Oakwood Drive had security cameras after the break-ins 2 summers ago, which is why what happened that night was captured from so many different angles. Since my divorce, I'd settled into a predictable rhythm. Warehouse job outside Madison, Wisconsin, late shifts ending at midnight, and the same route home 5 nights a week. At 32, I was old enough to appreciate a quiet routine, especially after the chaos of a messy split. That Halloween fell on a Tuesday in 2017. Work was normal. We shared fun-sized candy bars, complained about the freezing scanning system, and joked about being stuck working while kids were trick-or-treating. Normal night, normal conversations, normal everything right up until I clocked out at 12:03 a.m. and headed to my car. Madison gets quiet after midnight, but that drive home felt like traveling through a ghost town, and not in the festive sense. The University District usually has a few drunk students wandering around, even on a weeknight, but the streets were completely empty. Not just empty, but wrong somehow, like everyone had gotten a memo I'd missed about staying indoors. The 20-minute drive felt longer with no other cars on the road. Just me and my headlights cutting through patches of fog that had rolled in from the lakes. Every house I passed still had porch lights on, the universal signal that candy was available, but it was far too late for trick-or-treaters. The McDonald's was dark. The gas station that never closes had its pumps shut off. Even the police car that usually monitors the speed trap was gone. By the time I turned onto my street, my brain was struggling to rationalize it all. Maybe a big event was happening downtown, or the weather forecast had warned about storms, or maybe I was just tired and overthinking. My driveway is long and gravel, curving slightly for about 40 feet from the street to my garage, lined by those overgrown juniper bushes. As my headlights swept across the gravel, 2 figures came into view at the very end of my driveway, right where it met the sidewalk. They were standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. Both wore vintage clown masks, not the cheap plastic party store kind, but old-school rubber ones with wild orange hair, huge red noses, and smiles that stretched way too wide. One was notably taller, maybe 6'3", wearing what looked like mechanics' coveralls splattered with dark stains. The shorter one, about 5'8", had on a faded yellow raincoat, despite weeks without rain. They weren't moving or talking, they just stood there like mannequins placed at the end of my driveway as the world's worst Halloween prank. My first thought was college kids being idiots. I even laughed a little, reaching for my phone to snap a picture. But as I got closer, my headlights illuminated them better, and that's when I noticed what the taller one was holding. Down by his side, gripped in his right hand like it weighed nothing, was a sledgehammer. Not a prop, but a real sledgehammer with a worn wooden handle and a head that had seen serious use. The shorter one's hands were empty but stayed weirdly positioned at stomach level, fingers spread wide as if pressing against invisible glass. Neither reacted to my car approaching. They didn't shield their eyes from the high beams or shift their weight. They just kept staring through the mask eye holes, and even from inside my car, I could see their actual eyes behind the rubber. Wide open, unblinking, focused directly on me. I stopped my car about 15 feet from them, engine running, doors locked without even thinking. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was a prank, but my gut was screaming the opposite. There was something methodical about how they stood, something practiced and deliberate. I hit my high beams, flooding them with even more light. Still nothing. No flinch, no movement, just that horrible stillness. That's when I noticed other details that made my mouth go dry. The taller one's coveralls had fresh mud on the knees. The sledgehammer had something dark and wet on its head that was definitely not rust. The shorter one's raincoat had 3 parallel rips along the bottom, like something had clawed at it. My hand fumbled for my phone as I tried to dial 911 while keeping my eyes on them. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. "There are 2 people in clown masks blocking my driveway," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "One of them has a sledgehammer. They're just standing there, not moving, and I'm trapped in my car." I rattled off my address, and the dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger. Before I could answer, both clowns tilted their heads to the left at exactly the same moment, like synchronized swimmers performing some twisted routine. The movement was so sudden and coordinated that I jumped in my seat. "They're moving," I said into the phone, my voice cracking. "Please send someone now." The dispatcher assured me units were on the way. "Stay in the vehicle, keep the doors locked, and stay on the line." She asked me to describe what they were doing. The taller one had started tapping the sledgehammer against his palm. Slow, rhythmic taps that I could actually hear through my closed windows. The shorter one began a weird swaying motion, shifting weight from foot to foot like a boxer warming up, those spread fingers finally curling into fists. Then they started walking toward my car. Not running, not rushing, just walking with measured, deliberate steps that somehow felt more threatening than if they'd charged. I kept narrating for the dispatcher, but my voice was getting higher, tighter. "They're coming closer, maybe 10 feet away now. The tall one is raising the hammer." That's when I threw the car in reverse, tires spinning on the gravel, backing up fast toward the street. But my driveway curves, and backing up in a panic is not precision driving. I clipped one of the juniper bushes, felt the car lurch, overcorrected, and ended up with my back wheels in the grass. The engine stalled in the sudden silence. I could hear them crunching across the gravel, getting closer, and the dispatcher saying units were 3 minutes out. But 3 minutes felt like 3 hours when those masks were reflecting in my mirrors. I got the engine started again just as the sledgehammer came down on my hood. The metallic crash made my ears ring and left a dent the size of a dinner plate. The shorter one pressed both palms flat against my driver's side window, and I could see every detail of those hands through the glass, dirt under the fingernails, scratches across the knuckles, and a gold wedding band on the left ring finger that somehow made everything worse, because it made them human real. They started dragging their hands down the window, leaving these greasy smears, and that's when I heard it laughing. Not maniacal movie villain laughter, but a low, satisfied chuckle coming from behind both masks. I gunned it backward again, heard them stumble away from the car, and managed to get onto the street properly this time. I pulled across the street into Harold's driveway, my neighbor, and kept my headlights pointed at my house, engine running, ready to bolt. From Harold's driveway, I watched them through my windshield. The 2 clowns stood in my yard for a moment, looking at each other like they were having a silent conversation. Then the shorter one walked over to my mailbox, a sturdy metal thing my ex-wife insisted on, and the taller one followed. Without any hesitation, the tall one swung that sledgehammer in a perfect arc and demolished the mailbox post in 2 hits. The whole thing toppled over into the street with a hollow clang that echoed through the neighborhood. But nobody came out to look. Not Harold, not the Andersons next door with their new baby, not even Doug who worked security. Every house stayed dark and quiet, except for those porch lights, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The clowns started walking down the street, not hurrying, and stopped at the Andersons' driveway. The shorter one produced something from that yellow raincoat, a screwdriver maybe 8 inches long, and went straight for the Andersons' minivan tires. 4 quick, efficient punctures, 1 for each tire. The hissing sound carried all the way to where I sat. The taller one took the sledgehammer to their garden gnomes, pulverizing each ceramic figure with single swings. They moved to Doug's house next, and I watched the tall one cave in the windshield of his pickup truck. The dispatcher kept saying units were almost there 1 minute out. But these two were working their way down the street like they had all the time in the world. Every few houses, they'd stop, look back at me, and do that synchronized head tilt again. They wanted me to watch this whole thing. The worst part was how quiet they were, no whooping or yelling, just the sounds of destruction and those occasional low chuckles. Finally, I saw the blue and red lights coming down the street. 2 squad cars, no sirens, but lights flashing, moving fast. The clowns saw them too. They were standing in front of the Thompsons' house, about 6 houses down. When the lights appeared, they just stopped. They didn't run or panic, just stood there facing the approaching police cars. The police pulled up, blocking them in, officers getting out with hands on their weapons, shouting commands. The 2 clowns raised their hands slowly, the tall one still holding the sledgehammer, until an officer yelled at him to drop it. It fell to the pavement with a clang that seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging over the neighborhood. Suddenly, porch lights were flicking on. People came streaming out of their houses in robes and pajamas, everyone talking at once. Harold came running out to his driveway, asking what the hell was going on. I couldn't even answer him, just pointed at the cops putting handcuffs on the 2 figures, who were still wearing those horrible masks. The 2 men were brothers from a town about 40 minutes away, Tommy and Carl Bradshaw, ages 26 and 29. They'd driven up to Madison with a trunk full of tools and no explanation that made any sense. When the police asked them why they did it, why they picked my street, and why they waited at my driveway first, they wouldn't say a word, remaining completely silent in interrogation. The detective told me they found my address written on a piece of paper in their car, along with 3 other addresses in different Wisconsin towns, but no connection between any of us. They both pleaded guilty to vandalism, property destruction, and menacing. They were sentenced to 18 months each and served 8. I never found out why they came to Oakwood Drive that night, why they waited at my driveway, or why they wanted me specifically to watch what they did. The security footage from all the houses showed them arriving at exactly 11:47 p.m., standing at the end of my driveway for 13 minutes before I got home. Never moving, never checking phones, just waiting. I moved out of that house 3 months later, got an apartment closer to work with a parking garage and a doorman. But every Halloween, when I see kids in clown costumes or those decorative masks in store windows, I remember that night and wonder if Tommy and Carl Bradshaw are out there somewhere, maybe wearing different masks this time, standing at the end of someone else's driveway.